Welcome to another episode of Medicine 3.0, your podcast for AI in medicine, precision medicine. And this week, I've got Dr. Mike Rucker. He's a PhD in psychology, organizational psychology. He wrote a book called The Fun Habit. And this was such an interesting conversation because many people, when they think of fun, they think frivolous. And what Mike teaches us is you can just make everything in your life a bit more fun and enjoy your life that much more. And I think this was such an interesting conversation. I hope you enjoy it. All right, Mike, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, so let me start with my question that I ask everyone. Tell me how you got where you're at knowing what you know.
So my research interest has been this idea of fun. And the way I got there, I was a charter member of the International Positive Psychology Association. So for folks that don't know what positive psychology is, it's essentially a facet of psychology that really got popular at the beginning of the millennium. All these clinical psychologists and practitioners had realized that up until that point, psychology had really only been used to treat deficits, things like, poor mental health. And yet all these tools existed like mindfulness and gratitude that could be used by anyone for betterment. And so rightfully, because, at the onset, we kind of picked the biggest thing, right? And that was happiness. So we looked at happiness for quite some time and, created the World Happiness Index, created this idea of subjective well-being where we quantify what happiness means and all of these things. What happened along the way is, because of this huge focus on happiness, we got people to essentially overprescribe to happiness as an ideal, right? Now we have a term for it because this has legs, right? We call it toxic positivity. But what we found is that by telling everyone that they need to be happy, right? And at its worst, this good vibes only mentality, that we were eroding emotional flexibility. And that certainly happened to me. I'm also part of the quantified self movement. And so I was literally life logging and trying to figure out what was the best day, what would create, just an immense amount of happiness for myself. And I got pretty good at it. In 2016, I was, firing on all cylinders. And like everyone, I had a series of unfortunate events. I lost my younger brother quite suddenly to a pulmonary embolism. I was a lifelong runner. I was starting to do Ironman, and I found out that I had advanced osteoarthritis due to an injury, not, genes, but, likely tore my labrum at some point and it went unnoticed. So had to get a hip replacement at an early age. And my wife got this amazing opportunity in North Carolina. And so we relocated from San Francisco to North Carolina. And that's only important because of the other two things. Generally you could fall back on friends and family, right? But we were also losing some of that safety net. And so I had this trifecta of things happening to me. And yet I was pretty Pollyanna about happiness. I'm like, well, I've done this before. I can will myself out of this. And especially with regards to processing my, brother's passing, not giving myself that space and having lost that emotional flexibility, just to not be able to process, the slings and arrows that are going to happen to all of us, right? I realized something bad had happened. Luckily, I do have access to things like PubMed, and some amazing research came out right around that time that was suggesting we were on the wrong path as, kind of positive psychologists, and that this holding up happiness as an ideal was becoming problematic. Actually, paradoxically, anyone that kind of prescribed to that were some of the most unhappy people, right? And now it's easy to understand. You create this space in between the mirage of happiness and where you're at, right? And you constantly stare at it through rumination. Of course, it's going to bleed into your identity. Well, happiness is here and I'm not happy, so I must be an unhappy person. And what happens when, something supplants into your identity, you start to look for artifacts. It's just human nature too, right? That's why it's so important for healthy behaviors to get folks on board with that identity, right? I'm a healthy eater, so that you have this filtration to make healthy choices. But when that goes awry, then those same mechanisms happen, right? And you start to be like, okay, well, everything is just heavy and I'm not happy. And so that happened. And I was aware of it, so that was the starting point, right? But if happiness was problematic, then I mean, it can't all be bad, right?
Right.
And
Yeah.
so I was like, there's got to be something else here, and that's where I really started to look at the research around fun and pleasure and what we call hedonic tone. Like how do we find things that are enjoyable despite our emotions? And it's been a really fun journey since then. I think just kind of the geek side of it, most of that science lived in social science. And so I'm an org psychologist, I'm not a clinical psychologist. So I had access to that. And so I think that's what was fun for me is like, oh my, besides play research, which just tends to be, in the educational domain, this idea of, what happens when we can get people to enjoy their time was all kind of locked in there and not in a clinical setting. So now other researchers have done it. Jordan Etkin, in your neck of the woods out of Duke, Cassie Holmes out of UCLA, and they're still all at business schools, right? But they're social psychologists that have brought this to the forefront. But at the beginning, again, it was all there for the taking, but no one was talking about it in lay media. And I was like, oh my goodness, even though it has its roots in mindfulness, it's also how do we enjoy the things that we're doing so that we can index joyful experiences to then create happiness as a byproduct, right? And so when people ask me, so what is the difference between fun and happiness? I look at fun as this action orientation, right? Because we can essentially go have fun whenever we want. The first time you and I connected, just taking it into nature, right? That was much more enjoyable than sitting in a conference room. And that was a deliberate choice, right? So there is something where we made an effort to have more fun in our first, engagement, where so many people just, it's easy, the conference room's around the corner, let's just kick it there, right? And so those little things indexed over time have a huge impact. We generally never think about them because we're not deliberate about those choices, especially as we get older, right? And we habituate our behavior. I mean, to some degree, we need to put our life in autopilot, or, in the information age, we would be overwhelmed, right? I mean, part of this is a safety mechanism, but we forget that we still do have some agency and autonomy. And so if we can flex that to create some joyful experiences, even if they're micro joys, especially in this sandwich generation that a lot of adults live in, where they're taking care of kids and also aging parents, as long as we remind ourselves out of that 168 hours that we have, that we can control some of it, we're able to kind of get back on our feet, even if it's during a period like I was with the loss of my brother, where happiness isn't the appropriate emotion. But, finding joy in the comfort of time with my best friend, making sure that my kids and I are doing things that, bring joy so that everyone benefits, through something like social contagion, rather than just, drowning everyone along with me. Those are important choices to make. And I think that's why this idea of fun, as trite as the word is to a lot of people, has become, important for us to discuss.
Yeah. I'm really excited to dig in on the idea of looking for fun, making things more fun. It's interesting to hear you talk about the ills of positive psychology and toxic positivity. I grew up, my mom is a wonderful person. She's 85 and but struggled with depression her whole life and loved positive psychology and still does to this day. Like as a teenager, I'd grow up and my mom trained me to say like best day ever every day. And I mean, of course, like I knew it couldn't be the best day ever, like every day. But she's also kind of struggled with happiness because I think of what you said, the problem is there's this mirage. You're like, I keep telling myself I'm so happy, but I'm not. What's wrong with me? And
when
so,
I think in your telling, just to unpack it a little bit, right, is that some of those tools, like let's take DBT, right, which does treat people, or excuse me, trains people, is the right word, to look for joy. It doesn't make happiness the ideal, right? And so, again, we don't want to villainize the practice because there are a lot of good things there, right? But the fact that someone is now saying, hey, in every one of your days, this is what you want to strive for. I meant, in just the telling, you identified the issue, right?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And I think honestly, we fall into this often. We want these blanket tools that we can use in every single facet of our lives. And I mean, you spoke to this with the loss of your brother. You know, myself, though, over the last 4 years, I've lost two loved ones, my dad and my
I'm sorry.
brother-in-law, and it's so painful, right? And
Hmm.
and you know, that grieving process, like you spoke to how you find joy in that grieving process, like being with a friend and the comfort of your friend giving you joy. I think that's beautiful to realize that you can have grief and joy at the same time. I even, you know, even at the loss of those loved ones, there are these tremendous moments where you come together as loved ones and mourn together and you grieve together, and those are joyful but not happy like
Yeah,
you would normally think. I'm curious, to just stay on that for just a second before we
sure.
move on. When when you think of using these tools, when somebody is grieving, like if you're going to use the tool of fun or making things more enjoyable, then how do you think about it?
So I want to take a step back real quick,
Yeah.
but it will be a good bridge, right? And I think
Okay.
the problem is that when we look at these things, especially if we extrapolate out teachings from findings, we forget that it's on a normal curve, right? And
Mm.
so one of the things that I think is the most illuminating with regards to all of these tools, but is helpful, is Sonia Lyubomirsky's work with regards to gratitude, right?
Mm.
Because do you remember Freakonomics where they're like,
Yeah.
we have no idea where this 8 cups of water came from, right?
Yeah.
And there's
Yeah.
still some proof that we should stay hydrated, but like this, so the same thing happened with gratitude. I think there is maybe some small indications that 3 is, the right number as a broad-based intervention, but it's clear that for a significant proportion of the population, telling them to find 3 things to be grateful for a day is actually harmful, right?
Mm.
It creates moral injury. The same way, it's probably not the right advice for your mom to say, make sure every day is better than the next. And so any of these things, we need self-experimentation, right? Because I certainly wouldn't be able to stick with an intervention that had me looking for gratitude 3 times a day because I just don't
Mm.
find novelty in that after a certain amount of time. Yet gratitude is an amazing tool. I do make sure that I use it once a week, right? And so to get back to your question, I do think it requires self examination, right?
Yeah.
I'm wired that laughing out of the uncomfortableness at a funeral, even my brother's with my best friend, was appropriate because
Mm.
laughter is an amazing tool. It doesn't necessarily mean you're laughing at the situation.
Yeah.
It was a release valve of emotion that then led to crying, that then led to healing, right?
Yeah.
But another person will see someone laughing at a funeral and go, what the. And
Yeah.
so to have a broad-based suggestion wouldn't be right, but to say, please self-experiment with what is right for you, and that does make you feel like you want to stay in that moment, right, for however long as you preserve the space for when you don't want to feel like you're having fun, right? So these little escapes so that you can create the psychological safety to process is important, because if you're always kind of in a downward spiral, we know you tend to stay in there, right? So you
Yeah.
need to be reminded that there are things out there, that life, we call this dispositional gratitude, that life is abundant with really great things. It's also abundant with really shitty things, but
Yeah.
you do have the power to steer your boat towards the good once you're done, feeling safe that this shitty thing happened.
Yeah.
Sorry that
Uh,
I just got us into PG-13 realm.
that's all right. That's all right. Um, the the interesting thing about your response was, uh, I liked that you didn't give, broad based, like this is how you fix grief with fun. Um,
Right.
because I think it is so important for people. Like people are looking for the magic pill, like the one thing that they can do that makes everything better. But I think it's important for people to realize that self experimentation is so important. And this, I think, leads us perfectly into kind of where you went from 2016 till now in your exploration and even your book. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about the self-experimentation needed to understand fun and how to have fun and where to use fun in your life.
Yeah, so it begins simply by becoming aware of how you spend your time, right? Because so many of us have habituated our lives. This is something that I love to talk about when I'm on a health podcast. One of the things that I found so interesting is one time we were looking at providing some contextual awareness of how people were using our gym equipment. And so we had monitors, people opted into this. And when a piece of equipment, especially cardio equipment, would break, we had multiple members go to that piece, even though there were pieces that still worked on the left and right. And if their machine was broken, they would leave. Like, that's how habituated we are. And then when we would call them out on it, they go, I didn't do that. No, you did. And they're like, oh my gosh, I did do that, huh? I just love that machine. Well, it's no different than the machine next to you, right? And I only bring that up is that every time, it's similar to asking someone to do a nutritional journal. They're never fun, right? But they're so enlightening. Like, oh my gosh, I do kind of eat horribly, right? I just didn't want to admit that. And like, oh my goodness, 90% of what I do is on repeat every week, right? And so I probably could make better choices. It's good that Google and Apple did finally provide those health meters in the phone, right? Because so many people are blown away. Sometimes it's not social media. Sometimes it's something like Slack. Like, I do not need to be in Slack 25 hours out of the 168 that I have. That is not a good use of my time. I could probably time block that, still, be professionally productive. But what I'm doing is reading my friends' memes, right? Or whatever it is. And so, to answer your question, it's starting with that awareness. Like, can you just look back at the 168 hours in your week and figure out where are opportunities to reduce? Because we want to start by creating space, right? If having fun is just another thing on your busy to-do list, it generally will fail. So where are these pockets where, in psychology, we have a geeky word for it, where you're engaging in passive leisure, right? And generally a good test for, is it passive leisure, is if I asked you a week from now how you spent those 2 hours on Thursday night because you were just channel surfing, right, on the couch. I think I watched this show. Like, you couldn't tell me in rich detail what it was, opposed to watching Yellowstone with your partner, on a Thursday, where you're like, I just remember cuddling my partner and I remember the show did X, Y, and Z because we love it. And then we talked about it afterwards, right? And I always preface that just to make sure people know I'm not villainizing media, because I think, in context, it can be helpful. But if we're just kind of an autopilot and we're not doing anything that fills us up, we know that it's a slow burn to the bottom. And so one of the key pieces of research when I was putting the book together, because I had formulated my hypothesis, but I didn't really have like a key landmark, study, because again, I was pulling it all out of social psychology. And it just so happened that something completely out of the realm of psychology hit my desk. And it was this massive study, MIT, Stanford, and Harvard, looking at the hedonic flexibility principle more in the vein of time survey data, right? But it was really helpful because what they found, that the question they went out to ask is, are we truly pleasure-seeking animals, right? Because that old philosophical argument that we're always seeking, more pleasure or trying to avoid pain, right?
Yeah.
And so, no surprise, the folks that weren't having fun, that were kind of depleted, were engaging in poor forms of escapism, right? Things like, social media use, and then at its worst, drugs and alcohol and things of that nature. What the surprising find was that the folks that really were deliberate about how they spent their time, right? So these folks had transition rituals between work and their leisure time. There were ones that deliberately put things on their calendar so that they had time preserved for their friends and family or the hobbies that they enjoyed. What I colorfully call this, their fun cup was full. The folks that had a full fun cup were actually the ones that were then looking for harder challenges, because by their own design, they felt fulfilled, right? Like, my life is joyful. Now what can I do next to kind of push the envelope? So these are the folks that are looking for hard challenges, show up the next day to work, with the vigor and vitality to actually tackle the day because they know the day is going to be over. And then adjacent research also showed that the folks that are in knowledge work that are able to accomplish this also have the psychological space to think in a nonlinear fashion. So they're actually more creative as well, which intuitively, if you think about it, right? Remember, in times when you're burnt out, I mean, you're an MD, so when you were doing your rounds, you were probably relying on your heuristics, right? Like
Yep.
that algorithm A to B, how do I get through the day and just make it to the next? And once you're able to create this space where my life is okay, then you're able to one, again, think outside of the box and connect nonlinear ideas, but also feel psychologically safe to do some wrong things, to experiment. Because if something goes wrong, it's not the end of the world, right? But when we're feeling depleted, oftentimes those failures seem so much bigger. And so it has this whole host of benefits. But if you're not engaging in that, right, which a lot of us aren't, especially again in the sandwich generation, then we're just in this I have to do mentality, right? I just have to get through the weekend and then I can get to the next instead of I get to do, which is just, again, not just conjecture, a better space, but empirically validated that, once you get it right, you can get into this upward spiral where like then the work day is better, then, the part reserved for leisure is better, rinse and repeat, until you get it right. And then obviously, just like sleep, when we're trying to correct sleep deprivation, there's going to be a point of saturation where you need to stop having fun, right? And actually, Cassie Holmes out of UCLA did research in this. It's about 5 hours. Like if you feel that you have, like truly hedonic moments more than 5 hours a day, that's when you start to reach, as a generalization, this threshold of like, am I living a purposeful life? And that can get problematic. But and the same thing with sleep, right? Like, sleep hygiene is so important, and yet we wouldn't tell someone they should sleep 13 hours a day because that's better than 8, right?
Right. Yeah. So when you say hedonic, help me understand what you mean by that.
Yeah,
You and
thank
I
you
were
for the
talking about this
invitation.
before, and at first, when I hear that word, I'm like, ooh, like I'm not
Yeah.
sure I'm supposed to like that.
You and everyone else. And the same thing with pleasure, right? Which is funny because pleasure just means enjoyable, but we've associated pleasure with, adult activities. And so I see people grimace the same way. So hedonic tone in psychology, now we're using this word valence, I think for that very reason, but valence means less to, the outside world. So it's even, but so valence is just, are you enjoying things? And again, valence and hedonic tone are generally interchangeable, in the literature. But to bring it so that it's accessible to everyone, valence is just a spectrum, right? It comes from emotional science, and it's just the level of, are you enjoying and drawn to what you're doing, or are you repelled and not enjoying what you're doing? And so fun is just the right side of valence, right? The right side of hedonic tone. And so to answer your question, what hedonic means is, are you enjoying the things that you're doing, or are you repelled by the things that you're doing?
Okay. That's helpful. And valence, I know from like chemistry and things like that. And so it sounds like also valence is like a repelling or an attraction to something. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. And
Okay.
of course, what you're attracted to, you generally, you're going to find some sort of, yeah, I guess that's why they stuck with hedonic tone because,
Uh-huh.
I don't know if it's, and all these things get nuanced, right, in literature, but when we're drawn to something, generally it's because we want to do it, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So you talked about 5 hours, and people living from the outside could appear to be very similar lives, but one group having fun and another group not having fun, and kind of some of the purposeful things people do to have fun. If somebody is, living a normal life to them, and we all, normal is hard to define, but
Yeah.
they get up, they go to work, their job is fine, like they make a good living, they like the people they work with, but other than that, it's not super significant to them. They come home, they have people they love at home, but like how would you tell somebody, okay, these are some ways to think about interjecting fun and making your life maybe not appear a whole lot different, but make it more fun?
Yeah, and that's a great question. There's in the book, there's a host of different tools because again, I think one way is not going to work for the
Hmm.
next. Um, Generally, it starts with what we call in behavioral science just premeditation, right?
Hmm.
Get it down on paper because if you get it out of your head, it's more likely to happen. And then just a coaching principle: if you create options, you don't want to create like a basket of options because the paradox of choice certainly does apply, but having better options than you have now is a good use of time, right? Because then you can look at like these are things that I at least want to try. You might go out and try them and go, that was horrible. At least you know now that you don't want to do it again. When people are really stuck, maybe they're at a level of burnout where that exercise even seems sort of blasé. What I
Hmm.
generally suggest is see if you have a fun friend because most of us, right? Like social contagion is a real phenomena. And if you see someone doing things that you would want to do and they always seem like they're having a good time, generally those are the same type of people that do want to lift you up, right? They're
Yeah.
making good use of their time because clearly they're doing those activities and have figured it out. Um, and so if you invite yourself along, then generally they'll, you can have a conversation with them and also just have a model of what success looks like. Another tool that's kind of outside of that, if you're not doing it already, is create that transition, right? Because so many of us do bring work home with us. And so it's a tool that people have said once they've deployed it, if it does work for them, has been really successful. And that is, you know, whatever is helpful for you, when you get home, how do you reset? Like, okay, the work day is over, right?
Mm.
And even if that's just a couple hours, because in medicine, right, you guys, I think I shared before we hit record, I'm putting together a presentation for Cone. Medicine invented the concept of pajama time. A lot of different
Yeah.
vocations have pajama time, but it's certainly a term that was that came up through medicine. And so there might be a time later in the night that you have to go back to work that we can't engineer out of but if there is no true stop that you're deliberate about, like, okay, at least these 2 hours are going to be for me and the people I love. Um, if you don't have that space, then you can't be deliberate about that time. Because what we know with regards to cognitive load is if you're still thinking about something at work when you walk into the house, your brain's still at work. Even if
Yeah.
you're, kidding yourself that you're at the dinner table, right? Your child asks you a question, you're like, what was that again? So that you can get back to what you're chewing on at work. Um,
Yeah.
and so preserving that time, again, even if it's only an hour or two, becomes extremely important. And the problem is the upward motion and the downward motion are such a slow burn, right? And so a lot of the times, if we're only doing it for a couple of days, we won't notice the effect. And that has been a bit of a challenge, right? Some of these, positive changes, or quite frankly, the things that drag you down happen over months. And so again, we had kind of talked about most people looking for a quick fix. I mean, fun isn't a quick fix, right? It's
Mm.
something that you need to sort of integrate and do deliberately. I think the good news is you generally quickly notice, 2 to 3 weeks, like, oh my gosh, why didn't I do this before, right? So as long as we can keep that going, for 14 to 21 days, I haven't name dropped her this much in the podcast for a while, but Cassie Holmes out of UCLA again has she did an intervention where she just asked people to go into her weekend uh, thinking that it was a vacation, so no other prime,
Mm.
right? She didn't say preserve some budget or change your behavior. Quite the opposite. She said just be mindful that this is meant to be a respite from what was you know essentially what we think of work life, right? Monday through Friday. And just remember, it's not a continuation of the week. It is really meant to be, this break from the week. And I mean, no surprise, right? It was a huge benefit. People enjoyed their weekends much more. And not only that, but when they showed up to Monday at work, instead of it, feeling like an extension of Friday, it did feel like a new week, and they had more vigor and vitality to attack their work and felt better about work because when you're able to approach your work with fresh batteries, it's by proxy more enjoyable, right? Because it's like, okay, let's get to work instead of like, oh, I have to go to work, right?
Yeah. I love that kind of framing. Is you talked about, one of the keys being this transition between work and home and spending time with family. Do you have any suggestions of things that are in the research that you've seen that seems to be like some, possibly good rituals that people do to make that transition?
Yeah, again, I think it's gonna, be dependent on, your preference, but certainly like a quick meditation, using Calm or waking up, whatever, your app of choice. Some people, they need to walk, because physical activity for some is better than, meditative, depending on, um, some of the most interesting studies I found are from Timothy Wilson out of the University of Virginia. And there's certainly a gender bias here, but for men, we hate to be with our own thoughts. Like, have you seen Timothy's research in this area?
I haven't seen
So,
that.
more than half of men would rather have an electric shock than sit with their thoughts for 15 minutes, right? And so instead of like meditating and just, spiraling on what was at work, maybe going for a walk. For some, something as silly as just putting on a hat, right? Todd Herman is who I was trying to think of. He's a coach,
Okay.
but he was working with a military dad that brought, that military persona. He couldn't spin down, but he realized it was affecting his kids. And so it was as simple as turning his hat backwards. And I actually adopted that, and it worked well for me too, because it's like, now I'm that fun guy, and I'm meant to be the dad, and it doesn't mean that you don't discipline your kids if they're acting up. It just means I'm in dad mode. We're meant to, and so is it something as simple as changing your costume? Is it the reset of walking around the block? Are you the type of person where, you have the type of mind that you could clear it through, a quick 5-minute meditation? All of those will work for some people and not work for others.
Awesome. That's great.
But let me add one more thing there real quick, because I think it's important, and it falls back more on my discipline of organizational psychology. The reason this really resonated with me is the amount of research in org psych that suggests folks that take their lunch break, how important just that is, right? And you combine it with this research on fun. So folks that are like, my employer doesn't own my lunch break, I'm going to go take it with a friend, or if I'm an introvert, I'm going to read a book, or listen to a podcast, but getting out of the work environment so that it is a break, between the previous 4 hours. Those folks come back and crush the day in line with the research on the hedonic flexibility principle. And so I was giving a talk where I brought this up, not that point, but more just about, creating the space in these breaks. And I remember talking about reframing, and this person was like, man, this resonates with me so much. And she was stuck in the sandwich generation. She's like, I'm taking care of my mom. She's in cognitive decline, so we can't take holidays anymore. But I do have access to what I call hall hours. And I thought that was so powerful, right? Like, her lunchtime is her holiday, right? And so she makes sure that she's doing something that she enjoys, because that's the only space. But she's creating now 5 hours out of that 168, and it's a shame that that's all she has. Hopefully, I haven't checked in with her for a couple of years, but, if that's all you have, at least you've regained that, right? Where, so many of us are just like, I'm victim to my circumstance. So this, I can't do anything.
Yeah. I love the idea of taking what you have and using it and being purposeful and naming, like, this is my fun time. This is something I'm going to do for fun. And I think it's like you said, with the example of watching something with the loved one, purposeful entertainment versus passive entertainment, and the difference that makes in your life.
That's where,
yeah, go ahead.
That's where valence, I think, is helpful for folks that, do like that kind of continuum. Yeah. Because what we found is that when you are engaged in kind of unhealthy passive leisure, you can trick yourself into thinking it's fun, because you're getting out of that, you're alleviating to some degree that negative valence, but you're never in positive valence. You're just like, the day was boring or frustrating. So you're able to distract yourself, right, from that feeling, but it's not leading to anything that's filling you up, right? It's essentially empty calories. And so
that's useful.
Yeah.
The spectrum and realizing, yes, you're not on the negative spectrum, but you're not on the positive spectrum. So it's just kind of like blah.
Yeah.
I'd love to talk more. You recently wrote an article about healthy hedonism. And so I'd love for you to explain that, and especially as people think about, making habit changes, trying to be healthier, how that works.
Yeah, so we already kind of gave a nod that, it's funny because I think the word hedonism, automatically gets people to go, wait a second. And so that word in this context is more about hedonic tone and not hedonism with regards to the philosophical sort of teachings, right? And what we found is that with regards to, broad-based population interventions, the number one predictor of success is, are people enjoying what they're doing? Right. And so I think, with regards to short-term interventions, we had always historically looked at how can we have the biggest impact, right? And so I think before we hit record, we were talking about, yes, high intensity interval training can be really helpful in the right context, right? But when you have these things that are kind of hard and you really look at longitudinal data, most people, a normal population is going to attrit from these programs. And so how can we set up interventions that actually draw people in? And now I kind of feel validated because over the last couple of years, some big pieces of research, I think most recently out of the University of Minnesota, have shown that the number one predictor of people staying in healthy interventions is, are they enjoying what they're doing? And so I had this hypothesis because we know the success of motivational interviewing, right? And I think to some degree, that's what motivational interviewing does, right? Have you seen the success of MI in addiction science?
Yeah.
Like you tie, something that somebody wants to do, right, to trying to change a behavior, and you're much more helpful. So it should be no surprise, right, that if you rig the game in a way that people want to play it, that they're going to stick with it more. And yet we're always looking for the most impact. And so I think we kind of got it wrong, right? And not only that, but also as practitioners, we want to be successful. So we look at what the benchmark is and we're like, how can we get people to this, as quickly as possible? But like, let's take the, World Health Organization's recommendation of 150 minutes. For a lot of people, that's a boatload of exercise, right? And so how do we just get people walking first? I remember when I was first, this was over a decade ago, but really trying to figure out, I'm a big believer in self-determination theory. Should be no surprise since a key component of that is autonomy, right? But I believe that access to choice would be a predictor of an intervention being successful. And I was dismayed to find out that pretty much hands down, the best intervention is still step challenges, because the thing is, everyone knows how to walk. There is no cognitive load on teaching people what they need to do, right? Yeah. But I think if you pair that with some of the things that we've discussed, right? Like, how do you create it so they're actually pairing with a friend and you're not putting them in a competition per se, right? Because again, we know that's a very small pool of the population that's going to be motivated by a leaderboard. And even those, if they don't see their name on a leaderboard, are generally going to trip fairly quickly, right? I mean, they'll be motivated to try and get back, but if they never can, they're going to find a different tribe, right? And so, yes, you lower the bar to make sure that you're creating something that people can do, until you get them to a level of mastery. But where I'm going with all this is, I think more importantly, you also rig it so that they want to do it, right? Like, how do you create it so that it's something that, like, either my friends are there or it's in an environment that is something that I want to do. And so even though, my day job and my livelihood comes from running wellness centers, a lot of times I'll say, hey, if you don't like being in these four walls, have you tried going out in nature? And sometimes that's enough, right? I don't have the quant behind that, but I definitely have a lot of anecdotal success stories where they're like, you know what? I just didn't like being on a treadmill that goes nowhere. And now I'm hiking 3 times a week or whatever it is. And so, personalization is always going to have an extra burden, right? So I think, again, anyone that's listening that's trying to design these programs, I get it, right? Like, it's not like you can cater to an N of 1 all of the time. But what I do think is important is that we now have the data to suggest that the number one predictor of success of most interventions at the onset is enjoying what you're doing.
Yeah, I think it's such an interesting time for us also, there's this whole new, we have new drugs, GLP-1s that people are taking, and they're almost becoming moralistic, where people are saying, well, if people would just eat healthy, then they wouldn't need these medications. And if they would just exercise, then they wouldn't need these medications. And, we're going to have a new Health and Human Services and a leader, a new CMS leader, a very interesting time for us from a public health perspective. And you kind of mentioned this, like with kind of a public health hat on. Like if you're developing something with the public health in mind, it's hard to do individual. But even I'll say in the health optimization space, which you and I pay a lot of attention to, there's this idea that there's the right number of zone 2 minutes, the right number of zone 5 minutes, the right amount of weight to lift, and all of these things. And you're kind of pushing back against that.
Yeah, that's right. Well, if you self-select into the anointed, then I think that's right, right? Like for you and I've ultimately landed on being a MyZone customer. I love that company. Heart rate is now kind of a commodity, but they do a really good job. And so I'm being guided by the fact that I can play with that group because I self-selected in, right? Yeah. But in the book, I bring up, I'm a big fan, especially on the mindfulness side, of the Waking Up app. And Sam Harris talked about how he felt like he went wrong in his design by creating, quantitative mechanisms that essentially had people competing against each other, and then also inspiring you to do more of something that already had a pretty significant benefit within a time window that was reasonable. Instead of, like my muse, they might have changed it now because I haven't picked it up for a year, but was constantly asking me to meditate more, even though I was at a range that was pretty helpful, right? So yeah. I felt antagonized by, like, am I not good enough for you?
Right.
And so he called it spiritual materialism. And I, in the context of why he changed things, I thought it was interesting because, here's someone that does want to make an impact, like you and myself. And he was saying, I am making an impact, and now you guys are competing against each other. And so you're doing this for the external reward of saying, I'm a little bit better meditator than you are, instead of doing it because, it's a practice of, inwardness and, connecting with something that is this, whether you're spiritual or not, essentially bigger than our ego, right? And so I think in that context, it's figuring that out, right? Like, how do you create something where you're not necessarily leading somebody to an ideal that's unattainable? How can we create something that is scalable, lowers the bar so we can create the biggest tent? And then the work for us to do is then how do we lead people up towards mastery? And I think from a UX side, I haven't explored these ideas for a while, but when in the first iteration of my life, I was doing a lot of marketing campaigns, and you do try to educate end users in a way that feels comfortable, right? You're not going to give them the manual and expect them to read it. And so health is so complex, right? So how do you create an entryway? We always talk about wanting to be the front door of health, right? I've heard that, in various contexts across the digital domain. So great, we get people to enter, but then if it's like, this big oasis where people don't know where to go left, straight or right, that's problematic, right? They're just going to walk back out the door. And so, in the context of the question you asked, like, we need kind of the first step, right? And then, the burden on us is how do we create the complexity to make it contextually relevant as they move through that. And I think what will be interesting in the world that you and I live in is, starting with what is the biggest impact, right? Because I do feel like I was a big fan of GIF, and then they became Castlight. Are you familiar with them?
No.
I think they were a predecessor to Lytic, but okay. And I've had, I won't go. I mean, I like Drew a lot, but for folks that don't know Lytic or Drew, this would be a kind of hard turn to the left. But where I do want to go is and back to self-determination theory, this idea that, if we said, here's the menu, you pick, you would think that would be good because most of us do thrive in autonomy. But if you lead somebody, they don't know where to go, right? Mm-hmm. And so you do need to lead them, and you need to make sure that it's not so complex that they give up, especially, broad-based population interventions. So I think the burden on us is how do we create that entryway in a way that's most impactful, because then they get that early win, right? And so as a behavioral scientist, that's going to keep them motivated. And then we figure out what is the contextually relevant next step. Is it nutrition, which is, a pretty complex issue. So at that point, you need to know that they are fully committed, or is it something like, just drinking more water, or, I would assume sleep is the most foundational. So that's kind of, I didn't say it out loud, but I would assume that's where we start.
Mm-hmm.
Or if they've opted into what your specific solution is, that lowers the burden a little bit for the designer. Then it's like they've already opted into what you're focusing on. How do we educate them in a way that is the most helpful?
Mm-hmm. And I think the one thing that I think is really helpful is to think of the menu that they're presented. So, I'll use exercise as an example. So it's walking, it's running, it's biking, it's lifting, it's climbing. You have this menu, and then a willingness to understand and to help people understand that doing it in a way that you enjoy is so much better than doing it in the right way.
That's right.
And I'll just give an example. I wanted to be a runner for years, and I tried and I tried and I hated it every time. And then during the pandemic, I would just run and walk and run and walk. And eventually I was a runner. But before that, I was always embarrassed if I walked. I was like, I'm not a runner if I'm walking. And now when I talk to people and they say, well, I could never be a runner, I'm always just like, well, what if you just ran like 10 feet and then you walked for a mile? And then the next time you run like 15 feet and you walk for a mile, like just that incremental change, that little bit. And I think it's hard for people because they're like, no, I'm not a runner if I do that. Or no, that's not the right way to do it. And sometimes it's just like opening up to like, you can start wherever you're at and it can be very incremental.
It's funny you bring that up. Two quick things there. I've become, we haven't talked for a while, but I became friends with Jeff Galloway, who's the big run walk kind of guy. And, some of the vitriol that's been sent his way, yet he's helped. I mean, some folks have qualified for Boston run walking, right? And so come on, right? I get it. And I was villainized in my running group for listening to music, which is what makes running enjoyable for me, right? They're like, that's not pure running, like go jump, right? Like, okay, fine. But like to back you up, I had a similar experience with biking. And the reason I'll share it is I think it sets a good example for how you can play with variables to enjoy it. So when I knew that I wanted to do an Ironman, right? So I had kind of gotten the running down, but I wasn't a cyclist. I joined a cycling group in LA, and I was a struggling entrepreneur at the time. And these were all like private equity guys that, had these amazing bikes and all the gear. And, I was on like a used Cannondale, that cost me like $300 or whatever. And I just, one, I could tell they were like, what are you even doing here? And, and also even just that, because they were all not doing it for triathlons, so they, would really group really tightly with each other, which gave me a lot of anxiety. I was like, I must hate cycling. Like the same experience that you had, right? And Peloton wasn't out yet, but CompuTrainer, was still alive. I think they've now gone out of business, unfortunately. But I was like, you know what? I love video games, and I saw, my friend had a CompuTrainer. I'm just going to try this, and sure enough, it was enough to get me in a place where I was, could cycle well enough to do an Ironman. And what I realized, I didn't really realize it at the conscious level then, but now I've come to realize there's three things, if you're not enjoying something, that you should look at to potentially make it more fun, right? Is it the activity itself? So for me, it kind of was, right? The activity of true cyclists that are able to draft off each other was just too much for me because I was afraid I was going to get in an accident. It made it truly not enjoyable for me. It's just something I didn't want to do. But, triathlon, cycling, you can't draft, right? And so once I got a certain level of mastery on the CompuTrainer, I loved cycling, within that. The environment, like again, I took myself out of that environment, cycling, in a tight group like that onto the CompuTrainer till I was good enough. And then the people, once I got with my tribe of triathletes, then I was off to the races because I love triathletes. They're scrappy and, and they, some of them have bikes like me, so I mean, it's just, I think you can look at anything in your life and, if it's truly awful, then obviously it's not for you, right? And then also I'd like to have that asterisk that we're all going to have truly awful things in our life. Like life isn't meant to be easy all the time. I mean, anyone that's listened to Huberman, I definitely believe, that if you do things of passive leisure that are especially, dopamine seeking, it can get problematic. So we're meant to have challenges, but if there is something, again, where we're opting in, like running or cycling because we want to be healthy and we're not enjoying it, you can look at those three main variables and generally change your circumstance.
Yeah, I think that's those kind of insights I think are so useful for people to look at what they're doing or look at what they want to try as they try new things, and then really realize you can play with these variables. If it's not working for you, you should look at and make sure I got those: environment, activity, and people, and look at those things and figure out if you're doing it, if you're doing the right thing, if you need to change the environment, if you need to change the group you're doing it with. And I loved the one point that you made towards the beginning where you said, if you're not having fun, look at somebody that appears to be having fun and spend time with them. And I think more than ever in our society, when we've got this loneliness epidemic, that is also a wonderful point to make, as we know that people are happier when they have close connection and those types of things.
And there's been some interesting research. This isn't an area I know well, but I cited it in the book, that even if it's something that you don't like, if you're with a loved one, you generally still find value in it. Like, so the study looked at folks that didn't like musicals, but they would go to a musical with their loved one and they would at least appreciate it. And then they liked being with their loved one and seeing them like it. Yeah. The jump I made, and I think rightfully, is, but if you're kind of on the fence, like what a great way to explore, right? Like, well, maybe I'll like this. It doesn't seem like something I'd like, but like, let me try it with you, right? And then if you don't like it, then fine.
Yeah. And it's interesting how powerful framing is. So changing that frame from this is something I don't like, telling yourself it's something you don't like, to something that you might like, and how that changes the experience for you. So
yeah, absolutely.
That's interesting. Well, Mike, this has been awesome. Where can people find out more about you?
Oh, thanks so much. The Fun Habit's out now. So, if anyone wants to pick up the book, I'd love that support. Support your local bookstore. But if that's not an option, it's on Amazon. And all of my lay media can be found at michaelrucker.com. I aggregate it in my press section. So,
awesome.
Yeah.
Well, Mike, this has been awesome. Thank you so much. I'm sure people will come find you. And yeah, I hope that people find more fun in their lives over the coming year.
Likewise.
Thanks. Thank you for listening to another episode of Medicine 3.0. We make this podcast so that you know where to turn for good information on keeping you and your loved ones healthy. Feel free to check us out at bionichealth.com, where we can help you live a longer, happier life.